I'm going to be working through problem E8-19, which is on page 460 of your book. So we're basically going to be exploring the aging of receivables method to determine the allowance for bad debt and the adjusting entry to make at the end of this period. So the situation is we're at the end of the year and we have an account receivable balance of $230,000. The ending balance, this is the unadjusted balance of the allowance for bad debts, has a $24,000 debit balance. So this company wants to prepare the following aging schedule for its accounts receivable. So the first requirement is to journalize the year ending adjusting entry for bad debts and showing the T account for the allowance of bad debts, and also show how the company will report its net accounts receivable on its balance sheet. So the first requirement is going to have us start off filling out this aging table. So let's do the math here. The total here should be 230,000. It tells us it right here, but let's just add up this plus this plus this plus this. And just make sure that it's true. $75,000 So I am getting 230,000 as the total. Hopefully you are too if you're following along. So this is our total, and we should expect that to be true because our total accounts receivable balance is 230,000. So if we stratify it into these different tiers of age, it should still all total 230,000. Okay, so now we're going to do some math. We basically will take each strata and multiply it by our estimated percent of uncollectability. So for example, if the invoice is newer, 1 to 30 days, we have a pretty low expectation of it being uncollectible. While if it's older, over 90 days, our expectation is that it's much more likely that that invoice or this account receivable will not be collected. So as you see here, the percentages increase as the age of the account is older. So let's just do the math. The first one is 75,000 times 0.8%, which is 0.008. Make sure that you do your calculation keeping in mind the percentages. So 0.8% is 0.008 on your calculator. So make sure you have that clear. So I'm getting 680,000 times 4%, 0.04. It's 3,200. Do the same thing here. 2,100. And finally, for this last over 90 days column, we're going to get 19,200. So now you add up these different amounts to get our total target estimation for the uncollectible accounts receivable. And so when you add them up, you should get 25,100. So now let's check and see if we're okay here. Okay, so it looks like we did our math correctly. So now let's move on. So journalize the year-end adjusting entry for doubtful accounts on the basis of the aging schedule. Okay, so this is when we're going to have certain calculations come into play regarding the existing balance of the allowance for bad debts. So our target is telling us that we want the allowance for bad debts to be a $25,100 credit balance. Okay, so remember allowance for bad debts is a contra asset account, and it is a contra account to accounts receivable. Accounts receivable is an asset, it is debit normal. Allowance for bad debts is a credit normal account. So our target basically wants us to have an ending allowance for bad debt balance after we do the adjustment of $25,100. However, if we look, the current balance unadjusted for allowance for bad debts is a $24,000 debit balance. So not only are we going to have to credit allowance for bad debts by $25,100, we're also going to have to credit it an additional $24,000 to get it to zero, and then another $25,100 to get it to our credit balance of $25,100. So we're going to have to add this together. In order to get from a debit $24,000 balance to a zero balance, we have to credit it $24,000. And once we're at a zero balance, we have to credit it another $25,100 to hit our target. So the total debit amount is going to be $24,000 plus $25,100, which is $49,100. And so we're going to have to take a pretty big bad debt expense in this year. So even though our estimates for the uncollectible amount is only $25,100, since we had such a large debit balance, meaning we had under-reserved in the previous years, we're going to have to take a larger expense in this year. So this again is why this system of allowance is better than the direct write-off in terms of adhering to the matching principle, but it's not perfect because we don't always do the best job of estimating what our total uncollectible amounts are going to be during the year. And it could be that in a particular year we end up writing off way more than we expected, which looks like is what happened in this particular case, which is why we have a debit balance. So we will keep our note as recorded bad debt expense for the period, because we are basically doing an adjusting entry so that we have this expense appear in the right period and match up with the revenues that were generated in this period. So let's check our answer. Okay, looks like we're okay. Okay, so now hopefully this point of how we got this amount will be a little more clear when we do the T account. So we're going to have an unadjusted balance, debit balance, it tells us, of $24,000 for allowance for bad debts. This is our unadjusted balance. Now we see in this entry we're going to have a credit of $49,100. And our adjustment. And so when you net the credits and debits, we get to our $25,100 target, which we got from up here. So let's see if we did this right. Okay. Okay, so now let's see how our balance sheet is going to show our accounts receivable. So we have our accounts receivable, and we have a contra account. Remember, contra means going against. So we're going to have an allowance for bad debts. So we're going to start off with our total here, $230,000. And this $25,100 basically represents our estimate of how much of this $230,000 is going to be uncollectible. So we're going to have to subtract that. And again, it's the same balance that we have here for our allowance for bad debts after our adjusting entry. So it's going to be less 25,000, let's see, parentheses. And so when you take 230,000 and you subtract 25,100, you get 204 900. And so this 204,900 is what's going to be on our balance sheet. And we want that because we want to not overstate our assets when we present our balance sheet. So this 204,900 is what we expect we'll actually collect from our accounts receivable after taking some reserve for the bad debts that we expect. So let's check to see how we did. Okay, great.